Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into the historical forces, the frankly staggering human cost, and the intense geopolitical maneuvering behind the 1971 Bangladesh Liberation War. It's an incredibly complex, pivotal moment in global history. 93,000. Think about that number for a second. On December 16, 1971, 93,000 Pakistani personnel surrendered to joint Indian and Bangladeshi forces. To put that into perspective, you're looking at one of the absolute largest military surrenders the world had seen since the end of World War II. So the big question we need to answer is, how exactly did we get to that massive surrender? How does a peaceful, constitutional movement for autonomy snowball into overwhelming human tragedy, massive international controversy, and eventually the birth of a totally new nation? Let's start with Section 1, Origins of the Crisis, specifically looking at the geographic and cultural divides. To really understand how we got here, look at the borders established back in 1947. They were, frankly, a logistical absurdity. After the partition of India, Pakistan was created out of two mainly Muslim-majority territories. But here's the catch. East Pakistan and West Pakistan were separated by 1,600 kilometers of Indian land. They were literally completely disconnected geographically. And along with that physical distance came a really stark contrast in political reality. See, East Pakistan actually held the majority of the population. 54% were Bengalis, but the unelected civil and military elites sitting over in West Pakistan pretty much monopolized state power. Back in 1948, they even declared that Urdu, a language spoken by a mere 7% of the whole population, was going to be the sole state language. As you can imagine, this systemic dominance immediately sparked protests, laying the groundwork for a massive Bengali nationalist movement. Well, all of that built up to a major constitutional crisis. In 1970, the country held its very first free, democratic national election. The Awami League, which was a Bengali nationalist party led by Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, completely swept the election. They won an overwhelming majority. By all democratic rules, they had the right to form the federal government. But instead, the West Pakistan-based military regime just indefinitely postponed the parliament session. In response, the Bengalis launched a massive, peaceful, non-cooperation movement, bringing the entire eastern province to an absolute standstill. That brings us to Section 2, Operation Searchlight begins, marked by the violent military crackdown on March 25th. Things escalated incredibly fast in March of 1971. On March 1st, Parliament gets postponed. And while the military regime was pretending to negotiate with the Awami League, they were quietly flying thousands of armed forces right into East Pakistan. Then, on the night of March 25th, they just abruptly broke off all talks and unleashed a brutal armed strike. The very next day, March 26th, Bangladesh officially declared its independence. Now, the sources show this military operation was systematically organized to completely terrorize the civilian population into submission. They specifically zeroed in on the leadership of the Bengali nationalist movement. We're talking students, intellectuals, Awami League politicians, and even Bengali police and army officials. They also heavily targeted the Hindu minority community. The ground-level details of this crackdown are just harrowing. Eyewitness accounts from the sources reveal that on the very first night, the military attacked Dhaka University. One professor actually managed to secretly film the atrocities right from his apartment window. His footage showed students being forced at gunpoint to literally carry the dead bodies of their classmates out of the dormitories right before being lined up and systematically executed on the campus lawn themselves. Which leads us straight into Section 3, the blood telegram, as the rest of the world watches. While all of this is unfolding, you have to ask, what was the international community doing? Well, quote, our government has evidenced what many will consider moral bankruptcy. Those are the incredibly powerful dissenting words of Archer Blood, the U.S. Consul General in Dhaka at the time. He and his staff were watching the violence firsthand, but their urgent, desperate pleas to Washington, D.C. for intervention, they were met with absolute, deafening silence. So they sent what famously became known as the Blood Telegram. It was a formal dissent cable protesting the U.S. government's total inaction. And why exactly was the U.S. staying silent? Well, the sources point to a highly controversial geopolitical chess game. The Nixon administration, specifically Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger, were secretly using Pakistan as a middleman to open diplomatic relations with China. For the U.S. leadership back then, those massive geopolitical goals completely overrode the humanitarian disaster happening on the ground in East Pakistan. Moving to Section 4, a nation's heavy toll, focusing on the sheer human cost of the conflict. 10 million. Try to wrap your head around that. That is the staggering estimated number of refugees, both Hindus and Muslims, who were forced to flee the violence, pouring across the border into neighboring India. This massive exodus created an unprecedented international humanitarian crisis that pretty quickly grabbed global media attention. And for the folks who couldn't flee, the statistics from the military occupation are devastating. Bangladeshi authorities estimate that up to 3 million people were killed. Around 30 million people were internally displaced, desperately fleeing the cities for the villages. On top of that, systematic violence was heavily weaponized. It's estimated that 200,000 women were subjected to organized rape, very often in special camps run directly by the military. To truly grasp the intimate, on-the-ground reality behind those massive numbers, listen to this eyewitness account from the University massacre. The soldiers prod each body with their rifles or bayonets to make sure that they are dead. A few who are still wriggling in their death agony are shot twice until they stop. It was a completely cold, methodical campaign of terror. Now, Section 5, the instrument of surrender and the end of the war. As the resistance grew stronger, the conflict pushed into its final phase, largely driven by intensified guerrilla action from Bengali freedom fighters, and eventually direct military intervention by India. Finally, on December 16, 1971, a very public surrender ceremony took place at the Ramna Racecourse in Dhaka. Lieutenant General Niazi of the Pakistan Army formally signed the Instrument of Surrender, officially yielding to the joint command of the Indian and Bangladeshi forces. So, what were the terms? Well, legally, all Pakistani land, air, and naval forces had to lay down their arms completely. In return, the Indian commander gave a solemn, formal assurance that the surrendering personnel would be treated with dignity and respect under the rules of the Geneva Convention, while also guaranteeing strict protection for ethnic minorities in the region. Bringing us to our final part, Section 6, the quest for justice, looking at accountability and legacy. The war was officially over and the independent state of Bangladesh was born. But as you can guess, the aftermath was incredibly complicated. The path to actual justice, it was a very halting, stuttering timeline. Initially, Bangladesh really pushed to hold war crimes trials, passing the International Crimes Tribunal Act in 1973. But then, intense international pressure for regional stability led to a tripartite agreement in 1974 that basically forced the release of the Pakistani prisoners of war without any trial at all. Fact is, it wasn't until 2009, almost 40 years later, that Bangladesh finally established a domestic tribunal to prosecute the local collaborators who had aided in the genocide. And that massive delay, that halting path to justice, had a profound long-term impact domestically. Because of shifting military regimes and political expediency over the decades, many of those collaborators were basically pardoned, rehabilitated, and in some cases even handed political power. This failure to hold perpetrators accountable right away introduced deep, long-lasting political divides, a total culture of impunity, and a much higher tolerance for armed violence within Bangladeshi society. Which leaves us with a final, really provocative thought to chew on. As we look back at the heavy legacy of the 1971 Bangladesh Liberation War, we have to ask, how does a newly independent nation truly heal when the architects of its deepest wounds managed to evade justice for decades? It's a heavy question, and it's one that absolutely still casts a long shadow over the entire region today. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer.